My sister didn't even wait for the notary to finish speaking before she started texting people. I watched her from across the dining room table. Our mother's dining room table. The one with the wobbly leg that nobody had ever bothered fixing. And I noticed her thumbs moving under the table like she thought nobody could see. She was smiling. Not at anyone in particular. Just smiling at the news that hadn't even been fully delivered yet. That was the moment I understood something I'd been too generous to admit for years. She had already decided how this was going to go. My name is Lena Whitmore, and I was 34 years old the afternoon. My grandmother's estate was formally presented to our family in the living room of the house where I grew up in Kitchener, Ontario. It was a gray Tuesday in late October, the kind of afternoon where the light never quite arrives and the windows just look like mirrors. My grandmother had passed 6 weeks earlier, quietly, in her sleep, the way she'd always said she wanted to go. 81 years old and sharp until the end. Her name was Ruth, and she was the person in my family who actually knew me. I should explain what I mean by that. I am the older of 2 daughters. My sister, Brooke, is 4 years younger than me, and has always occupied a different category in our family. The category of person whose choices are explained, whose failures are temporary setbacks, whose successes are celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Olympic athletes. When Brooke got into university on her second attempt, my parents hosted a dinner. When I graduated with honors the first time, my mother said she was proud of me, and then immediately asked if I was dating anyone. I don't say this with bitterness. Or maybe I do, a little. But I've had enough therapy and enough distance from it to understand that this is a pattern a lot of families fall into without meaning to, and that it doesn't make the people involved bad people. Exactly. It just makes certain things very clear about where you stand. I moved to Hamilton after university, got my accounting designation, built a career working for a mid-sized firm that handles estate planning and small business taxation, bought a condo at 29, paid off my car, learned to budget for RRSP contributions. The same month, I started contributing to a TFSA. Which sounds boring, but which Grandma Ruth always said was the mark of someone who understood that the future wasn't hypothetical. Brooke stayed closer to home. She moved in and out of my parents' house 3 times in her 20s. She took a run at 2 different college programs and finished one of them. She's not lazy. I want to be fair. She just operates on a different timeline and has always found people willing to adjust their expectations accordingly. My parents adjusted. Extended family adjusted. Even Grandma seemed to adjust. On the surface, when Brooke was in the room. But Grandma Ruth and I had something I didn't fully appreciate until it was over. Every Christmas Eve, while the rest of the family was watching the same holiday movie they'd watched every year since I was 7, Grandma and I would end up in the kitchen together, ostensibly doing dishes. Actually, just talking. About money, about choices, about what she'd learned from my grandfather before he died, and from her own father before that. She grew up in a working-class family in Brantford, and she'd watched her parents make decisions that either protected the family or didn't, and she had opinions about all of it. She never told me what to do with my life. She just told me things, and then she'd ask what I thought. I didn't realize until much later that she was watching how I answered. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday, because that was when the notary, a careful man named Mr. Forsyth, had availability, and because my parents and Brooke all lived nearby, and could arrange to be there easily. I drove down from Hamilton on a gray morning, arrived early, and sat in the kitchen with my father drinking coffee, while he told me he thought this would all be fairly simple. Your grandmother was organized, he said. She had everything in order. I nodded. I knew she had been organized. I helped her update her filing system 3 years ago when she switched from paper to digital for most of her accounts. I knew what accounts she had, roughly. Or I thought I did. Brooke arrived 20 minutes late with coffee from a drive-thru, and immediately made the room louder. She hugged my mother, asked if anyone wanted a sip of her drink, and settled into the chair at the end of the table, like she was sitting down for brunch. Mr. Forsyth arranged his papers. I noticed Brooke had already stopped paying full attention. The early parts of the will were exactly what everyone expected. My parents received the personal property from the house. The furniture, the artwork, the small things that had accumulated over 80 years of living. There were specific bequests to cousins, to a longtime neighbor, to the church where Grandma had volunteered every Thursday for almost 2 decades. A small amount to my aunt in BC with a note that read, in Grandma's words, "I know you'll put it toward something practical." People laughed at that. I smiled. That was exactly how she talked. Then Mr. Forsyth cleared his throat. "There is one remaining matter," he said. "That requires some additional context before I read it." My mother straightened. My father put down his coffee. Even Brooke looked up from her phone. Mr. Forsyth adjusted his glasses and explained that approximately 7 years ago, Ruth had consulted with an estate lawyer and made a specific change to the structure of her primary assets. The house, her house, the brick semi-detached on Fairview that she'd owned outright since the mid-90s, had been placed into a family trust. Not transferred, not gifted. Placed into a trust with a designated trustee who would hold full legal responsibility for the property and all decisions related to it. My mother frowned. "I didn't know about a trust. Ruth established it independently," Mr. Forsyth said. "She was under no obligation to disclose it in advance. It was legally filed with a separate estate lawyer at that time, and the documentation is complete." Brooke leaned forward. "So who gets the house?" Mr. Forsyth looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at me, and I felt something shift in the room before he even spoke. "The trustee," he said, "with full management authority and decision-making responsibility for the property, is Lena Whitmore." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Brooke said, "Sorry? What?" My mother turned to look at me like she was seeing me for the first time that afternoon. My father sat very still. Mr. Forsyth did not repeat himself, but he did continue. He explained that the trust had been designed carefully. The property would remain a family asset. I could not sell it without a process. But all decisions, maintenance, rental, occupancy, long-term planning, rested with me. Grandma had written a letter of instruction to accompany the trust documentation, and Mr. Forsyth now opened a separate envelope to read it. Grandma's handwriting was small and even. Even being read aloud by someone else, I could hear her voice. She wrote that she loved all of her family, including her granddaughters, equally. She wrote that love was not the same as trust, and that trust was something different from affection. She wrote that over the years, she had watched both of her granddaughters make choices, and that the house on Fairview represented 40 years of careful decision-making, that she wanted to honor by placing it in equally careful hands. She wrote that she believed property should go to the person who understood what property meant. She wrote my name. Brooke pushed her chair back. Not dramatically. She's not dramatic in that loud way people sometimes imagine. She just pushed it back a few inches and crossed her arms and said, in a flat voice, "I don't understand this." My father started to say something. I don't remember exactly what. I remember that I was looking at the letter in Mr. Forsyth's hands and thinking about Christmas Eve in Grandma's kitchen. About the way she used to lean against the counter with a dish towel over her shoulder and say things like, "The mistake most people make is thinking that fairness means equal." About how I'd been 24 the first time she said that to me, and I hadn't really understood it, and she just smiled and handed me another dish to dry. I understood it now. After Mr. Forsyth finished, he answered procedural questions from my parents for about 15 minutes. The trust was legitimate. The documentation was in order. There was nothing to contest, because nothing had been done improperly. Grandma had been of sound mind, and had made this decision 7 years ago, long before any conversations about the estate had ever come up in the family. Brooke didn't say much during the procedural part. She asked once whether I could be removed as trustee, and Mr. Forsyth explained the conditions under which that could theoretically happen, which were narrow and did not apply. She nodded and looked at her coffee cup. When Mr. Forsyth finished and began gathering his documents. My mother asked to speak with me privately in the kitchen. I followed her. She stood with her back to the counter in almost exactly the same position. Grandma used to stand, which I noticed, and then tried not to read too much into. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No," I said. That was the truth. I didn't know she'd set up a trust. My mother studied me. She never said anything to you?" "She talked to me about a lot of things," I said, "but she never told me about this specifically." My mother was quiet for a moment. I could hear my father and Brooke talking in the other room, low voices that I wasn't trying to make out. "Brooke is going to be upset," my mother said. "I know. She had been planning." My mother stopped. Started again. She had been thinking the house might be a place where she could settle down, get stable. We thought it might be good for her. I looked at my mother and felt a complicated thing happen in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Not even surprise. Something that felt more like a door finally closing, gently but completely. "I know you thought that," I said, "Lena." "Mom." I kept my voice level. "I'm not going to do anything that hurts this family. The house is staying in the family. Whatever happens with it, I'm going to take care of it properly, which is what Grandma wanted." My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "She always trusted you." "I know," I said. "I just didn't know it went this far." I went back into the dining room. Brooke was on her phone again, but when I walked in, she put it down and looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not quite anger, not quite hurt. Something somewhere in between. "So what are you going to do with it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I need to look at everything properly." "Are you going to rent it out?" "I need to look at the numbers first." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I just don't understand why she did it this way. Why not just leave it normally and trust that we'd figure it out together?" I thought about that. I thought about Christmas Eve and dish towels and conversations that I had filed away under grandma wisdom without ever connecting them to something real. Because figuring it out together isn't the same as having someone responsible for it, I said. She wanted someone to be responsible for it. Brooke looked at me. Then she looked away. I drove back to Hamilton that evening in the dark, which in late October in Ontario means leaving at 6:30 and still not seeing any light. The 403 was moving slowly through Brantford, and I had the radio off, and I kept thinking about all the things Grandma had said over the years that I had filed away and half forgotten. About her own parents. About the house they'd rented their whole lives and how her mother had said it didn't matter because, at least the landlord fixed things when they broke. About how Grandma had saved for 4 years to have a down payment on a property of her own, and how the day she got the keys she'd cried in the parking lot of the bank, because she'd never had anything that couldn't be taken away from her before. She used to tell me that story every few years. I'd heard it so many times I'd stopped really listening to it. But, sitting in traffic on the 403, I finally understood why she kept telling it. She wasn't telling me about the house. She was telling me about what it meant to hold something carefully. To understand that a piece of property isn't just a financial asset. It's decades of decisions and sacrifices that someone made. So the next person down the line has somewhere solid to stand. She trusted me with that because she believed I understood it. I had to spend the next few weeks getting my head around what the trust actually meant in practice. I called an estate lawyer in Hamilton, someone I knew professionally, and we went through the documentation together. The trust was clean. Grandma had done it right. The house had been professionally appraised. 3 years ago, the municipal taxes were current. There was a modest reserve account that had been accumulating for about 4 years and could cover basic maintenance for the next 18 months without requiring any additional input. She had thought of everything. I drove out to Kitchener on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the reading, with the key that Mr. Forsyth had given me. I hadn't been inside the house since the week after Grandma died, when I'd come to help my parents start sorting through her belongings. The house was quiet, cold, because nobody had been running the heat, and I turned it up and stood in the hallway while the furnace kicked on and listened to the sounds the house made. Old houses make a lot of sounds when they warm up. The kitchen was just as she'd left it. The same yellow curtains she'd had for 15 years. The dish rack by the sink that held exactly 2 mugs, because she'd said anything more than 2 mugs was just clutter. Her handwriting was still on the calendar on the fridge, appointments written in pencil that nobody had erased. I sat down at the kitchen table. I wasn't crying, exactly. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't realize it until I found myself wiping my face with the back of my hand. Grandma never made me feel like I had to earn her attention. She never compared me to Brooke out loud. She never made it a competition. She just showed up for the conversations and asked what I thought and listened to the answers. And I had taken that for granted in the way you take things for granted when they've always been there. But she had been watching, and she had decided, carefully and quietly and 7 years before any of this became relevant, that she trusted me. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Triumphant, maybe. Vindicated. Like all those years of being the steady one, the reliable one, the daughter whose competence was assumed rather than celebrated. Like all of that had finally been recognized. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter than that. Something that felt more like responsibility, settling into my chest and deciding it was going to stay. My relationship with Brooke is complicated now, which I understand, and which I think is fair. She's needed some time. She didn't speak to me for about 3 weeks after the reading, and when we did speak, it was careful and a little formal in the way that things are when someone is working through hurt. I didn't push. I didn't explain myself. There was nothing to explain. I hadn't done anything. I'd just been the person Grandma chose. But I understood that knowing that didn't make it easier for Brooke to absorb. My parents took longer than I expected to find their footing with it. My mother in particular went through a phase where she kept raising small concerns about the trust. Was I really the right person? Shouldn't we consult a family mediator? Would I be open to discussing how Brooke might be more involved? And I listened to all of it, calmly, and reminded her, each time, that the decision had been Grandma's, and that my job was to honor it. I think it was hard for my mother to look directly at what the situation revealed. That her mother had noticed something she hadn't. That the daughter she'd loved steadily, but somewhat invisibly, had been trusted with something the daughter she'd celebrated loudly had not. I'm not sure my mother was ever comfortable with that, exactly. But over time, she stopped raising the concerns. My father came around faster. One afternoon in February, he called me out of the blue and said, "You know, your grandmother talked about you a lot more than you probably realize." He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. We sat on the phone for a second in comfortable quiet and then talked about other things. What I ended up doing with the house was not dramatic. I had an inspector come in. Minor repairs, some weather stripping, the kitchen tap, a section of the back fence. I painted the spare bedroom a color Grandma had clipped out of a magazine a few years ago and never gotten around to using. I had the hardwood floors refinished, which was an expense I weighed carefully, and which the reserve fund covered without stress. Then I had a conversation with Brooke. We had lunch in Kitchener in March, which was her suggestion. She ordered the soup and I ordered a sandwich, and we talked around the subject for the first half hour before she finally said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About being responsible for something." "Yeah? I think I've always assumed things would just work out," she said. "Like there would always be someone who'd figured it out. And I'd eventually figure it out too, and it would be fine." I didn't say anything. I'd learned from Grandma that sometimes the right response was just to keep listening. "I'm not asking for anything," Brooke said quickly. "I'm not saying this because I want you to change anything. She stopped, looked at her soup. "I think I understand it now. Why she did what she did."
"Yeah," I said it.
She nodded slowly. "It's not about who she loved more." "No," I said. "It's not." She looked up. "She trusted you. That's different." "Yeah," I said. "It is. We didn't hug when we left. We're not really huggers, my sister and I, which is probably something we both got from Grandma. But we walked to our cars together, and before she got into hers, she turned and said, "The floors look good, by the way. I drove past last week." I laughed. It surprised both of us. "I'll show you the inside sometime," I said. "If you want." She considered that. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, I'd like that." The house on Fairview still belongs to the family. That's the thing I want people to understand. If there's a thing to understand here. This isn't a story about one person winning and another person losing. Grandma didn't set this up as a punishment or as a reward. She set it up as a structure, because she understood that things without structure fall apart, and that families are no exception to that rule. She left it to me because she believed I'd hold it carefully, and the way I plan to honor that is by making sure careful is exactly what it continues to be. I was back in her kitchen last Sunday. I'd come to check on the heat before the next cold snap and ended up staying most of the afternoon, which I hadn't planned on. The yellow curtains are still there. I haven't changed them. I think about changing them sometimes, and then I don't. I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table, and outside the window, the Fairview Street traffic moved the way it always has, and the afternoon light came in sideways, the way it does in winter, when the sun is low, and the house was warm and quiet, and full of a particular kind of presence that I don't know how else to describe, except to say that it felt like being listened to. Grandma always said that trust was something you built without announcing it, that the people who talked most about being trustworthy were rarely the ones who actually were, that the point wasn't to be recognized for the right choices. The point was to keep making them. I think about that a lot these days. I think she knew I would.